Welcome to this lecture on biblical perspectives on death. Let's begin with some broad framework questions about religion, death, and health. Think first about how religions influence the views of death that their adherents take, and how this frames human experiences of death. So how might these religious views of death then come around to influence people's health? We're thinking about any number of possible religions here. Here you have a funeral, a ceremony among Muslims depicted on the left, and then on the right you have depicted a Roman Catholic priest administering last rites to a gentleman who is in the hospital and preparing for death. From this larger framework about religion, death, and health, let's narrow into some biblical texts and ask the question, first of all, how do biblical texts express the human experiences of death? And on this first question, I emphasize the plurality of texts and the plurality of experiences. We should not expect every biblical text to express the human experience of death from the same point of view, to share the same exact perspective. We can and do and will find varieties of experiences or perspectives on human death expressed in various biblical texts. And so one of our tasks when interpreting the Bible in general, and in particular with this particular question, is to guard the integrity of each text. When you read one passage, try to let that passage speak about death in the way it is trying to do so, without forcing it to say something else that may be influenced by your understanding from another passage in another part of the Bible. Think about, what is this person who wrote this passage trying to say about death, and how do I protect the integrity of that message? So then, with a variety of texts displaying a variety of perspectives, how do we move secondly to the question of how these biblical texts influence views of death? Our first question is about how these texts express the experience of death. But then we want to know, how do these texts and what they express influence the people who read them? So there's the experience within the text. Say you read a psalm, you're getting a psalmist's perspective of death. That's the first question. But then the second question is, when you or I or other people as readers of that text read it, how does it influence our view of death? Then thirdly, we move into how these biblical views of death influence the health of people. So again, we might think about this one in two parts. We might think about a psalmist who expresses an experience or view of death, and how do you think that person's view of death influenced his or her health within the text itself? But then for those of us who read this and allow it to push and probe our thinking, how do these views of death influence our health if we adapt them as our own perspectives? So then I assigned a few texts for you from kind of more the central portion of your Old Testament. We began with Job chapter 7, the entirety, verses 1 through 21. And so we want to look at Job 7, death and health. Now as we do so, it's important to cover one particular dimension of this text. One of the things Job is the one speaking in this chapter, and he is speaking in response to his friend Eliphaz, who spoke to him in chapters 5 and 6, I believe it was. Certainly in chapter 5, I'm trying to remember if it's 4 and 5 or 5 and 6. But Job is responding to Eliphaz, and Job's the one talking here, and one of the things he says in verse 9 is that he makes a reference to those who go down to Sheol. And it's important for me to clarify for you what Sheol is and what it refers to. Here we have an artistic depiction of the cosmology of the ancient Near East, including the people of ancient Israel. They did not see the world the way you and I see the world. It's not that their world was, that they had no science at all, but it's that their capacities for understanding their world were, compared to us, more limited. And so within the limitations they had, they did their best to understand and explain their world. And that's what we mean by cosmology, the view of the cosmos, the view of the world that these people had. And from the texts and other archaeological artifacts that these cultures left behind for us, we've been able to reconstruct faithfully enough how they understood their world. So here you have a depiction of it, and I'll bring my cursor up and maybe get us a pen. So one of the things about their world is that they believed their world was covered over top by what we sometimes translate in English as a firmament or expanse or dome or vault, and that actually the sun, moon, and stars were embedded within and moved across this firmament. So this was their cosmology about what lay over them from the standpoint if they were on the ground looking up. They believed that there were waters above this firmament, and that this firmament, this ceiling, helped to hold back the waters. This makes sense, for instance, if you can imagine them trying to make sense of and explain why the sky was blue. Now, the fact that this firmament is colored brown and imagined with bricks, don't let that get in the way. There are various texts that may suggest that they thought this thing was clear, but still solid. So that was their view of what lay overhead. They also had a view of the underworld, and in Hebrew, the word for that is Sheol. And when people go down to Sheol, that's a way of saying that they die. It's not the same thing as hell. This is not a place of torment or punishment. It's not a place normally where you think of people being judged and punished by God and being sent to Sheol. Not in that kind of sense. Those who go down Sheol is a way of saying those who die. And so when Job uses this expression, just bear that in mind. In Job's way of thinking and in common Israelite thinking, everyone goes to Sheol. Good people go to Sheol. Bad people go to Sheol. It's the realm of the dead. It's the way of referring to dead people. And it's understandable enough that they would think of this in terms of an underworld, because after all, you placed bodies in the ground. You buried bodies in the ground. And there's more that could be said here, but the bottom line is, within the framework of the world as they understood it, Sheol is the realm beneath them that is imagined as this kind of holding place. We could use the word dwelling place for the dead. So when you see Sheol, or if your translations in verse 9 here don't use Sheol, they might say pit or grave. Some of your versions may even put pit with a capital P or grave with a capital G. So even if you don't see the word Sheol, Sheol is the Hebrew word behind it. It's their word for the underworld, and it's functionally equivalent in many ways to later uses of the Greek word Hades, the realm of the dead. All right, well, let's move on then with this kind of cosmology in place and understanding how they saw their world and what happened to people when they died. Job's message in chapter 7, I summarize like this, where in the first 6 verses you have Job in responding to Eliphaz and his other 2 friends who are listening on. He claims or proclaims that life is hard, that life is short, and this is where his view of death starts to really factor in. Life's short and then you die. And therefore I will complain to you, O God. You have this lengthy complaint constituting the bulk of the passage, or the second half of the passage here. So this is one way of summarizing Job's message here in Job chapter 7. Now what I want to do is pose for you 3 questions. And what I would recommend you do is, after I raise these 3 questions, that you pause this lecture and have your biblical text open beside you and look back, skim back over through that text and try to jot down notes for answers to these 3 questions. First of all, think about what we've learned from Harold Koenig on the impact of belief. Here, what does Job believe about death? How does Job view death? What are some things he says? You might find at least a couple of things he says about death. Second, from Harold Koenig, we know about the influence of psychological state or mood on a person's health. So here, what is Job's mood? Does the text give you any indications for how to hear and understand Job's mood? Thirdly, think about social situation. Harold Koenig has taught us about the impact of social situation on a person's health. Well, what is Job's social situation? What is his relationship with his friends like in this larger context? And do we get hints or clues of it in this particular text? If not, we may have to draw on the chapters that surround this one. And then actually, I said 3 questions. There's a 4th one here. How might this view of death influence health? What Job views about death, his mood, his social situation. How does all this come together and influence a person's view of health? Imagine transferring Job's beliefs, psychological state, and social situation to someone else, someone in our modern setting, someone who views death the way Job did, who has the mood that Job has, who has the social situation that Job has. How might that person's health be influenced by these things? So again, I recommend that you pause now and take a look at the biblical text and think about, jot a few notes for each of these questions, and that will help, I think, round out your thinking and understanding of this text before we move on to our next one. Next then, we move to Psalm 6, a relatively short psalm. You're welcome. And we want to think about Psalm 6, death and health, much like we did with Job 7. I'm going to raise some questions for you again, and once I've raised them, again, pause this lecture, go back to the biblical text in Psalm 6, and see what kind of notes you can jot in answer to these questions. First of all, let's talk about current health of this person who is making prayer and supplication to God. This psalm is a prayer. It is a supplication where the person is speaking to God, addressing God about his or her condition. So what kind of health does this person have? What does this person say? Does this person give you any clues as to what kind of health he or she might have at this moment? Secondly, let's think about theology. I want you to look at the text and see if you can isolate at least two ways in which this person views God in the midst of this experience. Then we want to talk about this person's view of death. How does this person view death? And how does this person view a dead person's relationship with God in particular? There's something very interesting that is said here that may challenge what many Bible readers are accustomed to thinking about views of death that are lurking there in the biblical texts themselves. And then lastly, we return to our normative health question here. How might this view of death influence health? If a person today, or in any time period or cultural setting, had this kind of health with this view of God and this view of death, how might the person's health be influenced as a result of these things? So again, let's pause the lecture, return to Psalm 6, and see what kinds of notes you can jot in answer to these questions. Lastly, for our purposes, we visit Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And I must say, Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. But we want to ask about the intersection of this text, views of death, and views and influences on health. First of all, the book of Ecclesiastes, if you're not familiar with it, you probably treated it in passing in your Story of Israel classes, but here let's just revisit and refresh on some things. The book of Ecclesiastes is an ancient Israelite book of wisdom, and it is sometimes classified as skeptical wisdom, where the kind of wisdom being conveyed here is the wisdom of a skeptic, or brings a skeptical perspective to wisdom. That is, that there are some very common, conventional ways of viewing wisdom evident in places like the Proverbs, but then you get into a book like Ecclesiastes, and there is this shadow cast on, or this huge question mark put on the kind of wisdom that you find in a book like Proverbs. Proverbs sometimes makes things sound so easy and so direct that if you're lazy and slothful, you'll be poor, and that if you work hard, you'll have all your needs met. Or if you do good things to others, others will do good things to you, and if you do bad, it will come around to you, and people will repay you bad things. Now, there are exceptions to this in Proverbs. Proverbs is not nearly that naive, but if you read the whole of Proverbs, you could easily come away with this sense that life is pretty straightforward, that it's almost like a mathematical formula. If you insert the formula, if you insert the figures, the numbers, then you get a definite outcome. If you live your life in a certain kind of way, then you can expect certain kinds of results. Well, then comes along Ecclesiastes and puts a big question mark on all that and says, yeah, well, what happens when you do all these things and you still don't get positive outcomes, for example? Or even if you achieve wisdom, does it guarantee you a better life? So there's a lot of skeptical questions put toward and against wisdom in Ecclesiastes. And that framework, that approach to wisdom is itself part of the pursuit of wisdom, knowing what kinds of tough questions to ask about the pursuit of wisdom. So that's the book of Ecclesiastes. The perspective of it is you've got this wise king who's lived a lot of life, who has experienced so many things, and he is speaking to the readers or the listeners. When you read it, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself being in an oral setting in this wise person's court, in this wise king's court, and listening to what the king has to say about life and his experiences. He shares his experiences with others and the insights that result from the experiences that he has had. One of the most common conclusions the speaker of Ecclesiastes has is that everything's vanity, everything is meaningless. You try hard, you do the right things, you do the wrong things, you pursue so many different things to satisfy and give you meaning in life, and they all turn up empty. And this is one of the common, not the only, but one of the most common refrains in the book of Ecclesiastes, and therefore why we sometimes call it skeptical wisdom. The book has many things then to say about death, and I took you to a portion of Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and I want you to identify at least two things that this sage, this wise man, says about death. See if you can identify two. You might be able to identify more, but at least see if you can isolate two perspectives on death, or two dimensions of the experience of death that are laid out here. A person's preparing to die, and he has this perspective on things. What are those perspectives he has? At least two of them. And then again, our regular question about health. How might these views of death influence a person's health? So once again, take a moment, pause the lecture, and see what kinds of notes you can jot in answer to these questions from the biblical text. Lastly, to conclude this lecture, I'm going to direct you to the discussion board where you, together with your small group, are going to discuss what it's like to use the Bible to process and think about the human experience of death. Now, as you will see on the written instructions in the discussion board, this is a fairly involved discussion board, meaning the kinds of requirements. This one's worth 18 points. I think this is the most point value that's been allowed on any of the discussion boards. The key thing I want to point you to here is that you're going to go back and revisit Dr. Hamley's lecture from week 8 on death and dying. And you're going to need to pull 2 quotes from that lecture. So be prepared to do that. I've provided the link for that lecture in the discussion board descriptions for the instructions on the discussion board. So that should make it pretty easy for you to reopen that lecture and draw your insights to argue the points that you're going to be asked to argue here. I hope you found this lecture on biblical perspectives on death helpful, and I'll see you with our next lecture on biblical perspectives on life after death.